In Road 66 bars, a wrestling superstar was about to push his luck too far. What began as harmless showmanship turned deadly when a wooden chair splintered across the wrong man's back. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical retiree sipping water in the corner. For decades, he was a martial arts master and combat instructor, known for dropping opponents twice his size with a single, surgical strike. When Cena swung that chair with all his strength, he had no idea he was challenging a man who had spent a lifetime turning raw power into nothing more than wasted motion. Chuck's calm response would trigger a humiliation that rippled far beyond the bar's four walls. What began as a celebrity spectacle would become a lesson in true mastery. The dusty roadside tavern would never be the same after showmanship met substance and substance won. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The neon sign outside Road 66 bars flickered against the darkness, painting the gravel parking lot in pulses of red. Inside, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the tang of spilled beer. Country music hummed from an ancient jukebox in the corner, barely audible beneath the rumble of voices, laughter, and the occasional crash of pool balls. Mike Daniels wiped down the bar counter for the 100th time that night. 30 years running this place had given him a sixth sense for trouble. The crowd tonight was rowdier than usual. A powder keg waiting for a spark. Weekend regulars mixed with truckers passing through, creating that dangerous chemistry of strangers and alcohol. "Another round for everyone!" A booming voice commanded from the far end of the bar, cutting through the ambient noise. Mike glanced up, spotting Cena holding court at the largest table, surrounded by admirers. The wrestling superstar had wandered in 2 hours ago, and the place had been buzzing ever since. Cena's massive frame seemed barely contained by his tight t-shirt, muscles straining against fabric as he gestured dramatically, recounting stories from the ring. "You see that match last night? Ma. Grare. W4. Cena boasted, flexing an arm the size of most men's thighs. "They said Martinez was unbeatable. 2 minutes. That's all it took." His audience erupted in appreciative hoots and hollers. A young woman in a low-cut top leaned closer, touching his bicep with exaggerated awe. Another fan raised his beer in salute. "To the champ!" someone shouted, and glasses clinked together. Mike filled the order, sliding beers down the bar toward Cena's table. His eyes drifted to the quiet figure sitting alone at the far corner of the counter. A man in his 60s wearing a simple black t-shirt and jeans, nursing a glass of water. Most wouldn't look twice at him, just another aging patron keeping to himself. But Mike knew better. Chuck Norris hadn't said more than 3 words since entering. "Water, please. And thanks." He'd taken the corner stool, back to the wall, facing the room with casual vigilance. Nothing about his posture suggested tension, yet he missed nothing. His weathered face remained impassive, eyes steady beneath the brim of a faded cap. 2 college-aged men at a nearby table had recognized him immediately, whispering excitedly, "That's him. I swear it is." But they hadn't approached, something in Chuck's quiet demeanor keeping them at a respectful distance. A crash from the pool tables drew Mike's attention. 2 truckers were squaring off, arguing over a shot. Nothing serious yet, but voices were rising. "Hey, watch the language," Mike called out, his warning tone practiced from years of de-escalating drunken confrontations. The men settled, muttering curses but returning to their game. Crisis averted. For now. Mike exhaled slowly, wiping his hands on his apron. That's when he noticed Cena watching the near confrontation with interest, something predatory flickering across his features. "Pretty quiet night, huh?" Cena called out, loud enough for the entire bar to hear. "Thought a place like this would have more action." A few patrons chuckled nervously. Even in civilian clothes, Cena exuded the larger-than-life presence cultivated in the wrestling ring. Every gesture seemed designed to draw attention, head back when he laughed, arms spread wide when he spoke, voice pitched to carry. "We manage," Mike replied neutrally, sliding a fresh beer toward a waiting customer. Cena stood suddenly, towering over his table. "Let me help with that. Who needs entertainment?" He grabbed an empty chair, hoisting it overhead with theatrical ease. "In the ring, this would be the finishing move." The chair spun above his head, drawing gasps and cheers. Cena's audience ate it up, phones emerging to capture the impromptu show. "Should I put someone through a table next?" Cena laughed, but his eyes had a hard edge beneath the joviality. Mike tensed. This wasn't the first celebrity to pass through, looking to blow off steam where no cameras officially rolled. But something in Cena's demeanor suggested he was hunting for more than simple adulation. Across the room, Chuck hadn't moved, hadn't even glanced up from his water. But Mike noticed the slight shift in his awareness, the way his gaze now included Cena in its quiet assessment of the room. Cena caught it too. His eyes narrowed briefly at Chuck's apparent indifference. "Hey, old-timer," Cena called out, setting the chair down with exaggerated care. "Not impressed with the show?" Chuck took a slow sip of water, then set the glass down carefully. He didn't respond, didn't even look up. Cena's smile tightened at the edges. Around him, the crowd grew quiet, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Mike felt his stomach knot as he recognized what was happening. The classic collision of egos, accelerated by alcohol and an audience. He'd seen it countless times, usually ending with broken furniture and bloody noses. But this wasn't just any confrontation. Mike's eyes darted between Cena, all brash energy and tightly coiled power, and Chuck still as a lake on a windless day, but with depths no one could see. "I said," Cena repeated, voice harder now. "Aren't you impressed, old man?" The jukebox track ended, leaving the bar in sudden, loaded silence. Chuck finally lifted his gaze to meet Cena's stare, his expression unchanged. Then, with deliberate calmness, he returned to his water. Cena's face darkened. He rolled his massive shoulders, the gesture reminiscent of a bull preparing to charge. The air in the bar seemed to thicken, charged with the electricity of impending conflict. One of his companions said quietly, a note of warning in his voice. "Maybe we should—" "Maybe," Cena interrupted, his eyes never leaving Chuck. "Someone should teach the old-timer some respect." Mike reached for the baseball bat kept beneath the counter. In 30 years, he'd only used it twice. Tonight might make 3. The crowd sensed the brewing confrontation before it fully materialized, instinctively creating a semicircle of space between Cena's table and Chuck's solitary position at the bar. Conversation dropped to murmurs, then to nothing. Even the jukebox seemed to cooperate with the tension, falling silent after its last song faded. Cena stood, pushing his chair back with unnecessary force. It toppled and skidded across the floor. The crash amplified in the now hushed room. His entourage exchanged uneasy glances, but none moved to stop him. Like spectators at a wrestling event, they'd come for a show. And Cena seemed determined to deliver one. "Guess you don't know who I am," Cena said, taking deliberate steps toward the bar. Each footfall seemed to thud against the wooden floorboards. Usually, when John Cena walks into a room, people show a little more enthusiasm. Chuck raised his glass, took another measured sip of water, and set it down precisely where it had been before. His movements were economical, almost serene. "You deaf too, old man?" Cena's voice sharpened, his smile thinning. "Or just living under a rock?" A few patrons snickered nervously. Someone whispered, "That's Chuck Norris." But the words were lost beneath the mounting tension. Mike stepped forward, dish towel twisted between his hands. "Listen, we don't want any." "It's fine, Mike." Chuck spoke for the first time. His voice quiet but clear. "I'm just enjoying my water." The simple statement, delivered without a hint of intimidation or challenge, seemed to aggravate Cena further. His face flushed, muscles in his jaw working visibly. "Water," Cena repeated mockingly, now standing just feet from Chuck. "Real men drink something stronger than water." "But maybe that's past your bedtime, huh, Grandpa?" Chuck's expression remained unchanged. He didn't tense, didn't shift his position on the bar stool. His relaxed posture stood in stark contrast to Cena's coiled intensity. "The hell is wrong with you?" Cena demanded, irritation bleeding into genuine anger now. "You too good to talk to me? Think you're better than everyone here?" From the back of the room, someone called out, "Leave him alone, man. That's—" "Shut it!" Cena snapped without turning around. "This is between me and the fossil." He leaned down, bracing massive forearms against the bar, bringing his face inches from Chuck's. "I'm talking to you, old-timer. Show some respect when a champion addresses you." Chuck met his gaze evenly. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then, with the same deliberate calmness, Chuck picked up his water and took another sip. Something snapped in Cena's expression. "You want to play it like that?" Cena straightened, gesturing to the rapt audience. "Let me tell you something. I've broken men half my age, and twice your size. You think being quiet makes you tough? I've dealt with silent types before. They're usually the first to tap out." Mike moved from behind the bar, approaching cautiously. "All right. That's enough. This isn't that kind of place." "Stay out of this," Cena warned, without looking at him. Eyes still fixed on Chuck. "Your friend here needs a lesson in manners." "He's not looking for trouble," Mike insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Something in this confrontation felt different, dangerous, in ways that went beyond typical bar aggression. "Not looking for trouble?" Cena laughed, the sound harsh in the tense silence. "Everyone's looking for something. Maybe he's looking to remember what it feels like to be relevant." Chuck remained still, eyes steady, but expression unreadable. The only movement was his right hand, slowly lowering his water glass to the countertop. Cena's frustration visibly mounted at Chuck's continued non-reaction. His performance needed a response agreement, fear, anger, anything, and Chuck's calm was denying him the engagement he craved. "You know what I think?" Cena's voice rose, playing to the crowd again. "I think he's scared. Yeah, that's it. Sitting there all quiet because he knows what would happen if he opened his mouth. Am I right, old man? You afraid to admit John Cena's got you shaking?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter circled the room. Most patrons recognized the situation was spiraling, but no one moved to intervene. The atmosphere had shifted from entertainment to something uglier, yet the spectacle held them captive. "Back in your day, maybe you were something," Cena continued, circling Chuck like a predator. "But your day is long gone. This," he gestured to his own physique, "is what power looks like now." Chuck took another sip of water. The gesture, so simple and dismissive, hit Cena like a slap. His face darkened, a vein pulsing visibly in his forehead. "Okay. I tried being nice." Cena turned to his audience, arms spread wide in exaggerated frustration. "Can you believe this guy? I give him a chance to show respect. And this is what I get?" He stalked back to his table, where empty bottles and glasses littered the surface. For a moment, it seemed like he might be retreating, letting the confrontation fizzle out. Then Cena grabbed a chair. "Maybe this will wake you up," he he snarled, hoisting the wooden chair overhead with both hands. "John, don't," someone called out, but it was too late. In one violent motion, Cena brought the chair down across Chuck's back and shoulders. The crash echoed through the bar like a gunshot. Wood splintered, fragments scattering across the floor. The impact would have sent most men sprawling. But Chuck merely rocked forward slightly on his stool, hands flattening against the bar top to steady himself. Absolute silence fell. No one moved. No one breathed. Cena stood frozen, the chair's broken remains dangling from his grip, his face caught between triumph and confusion. He'd expected Chuck to crumple, to fall, not to absorb the blow, as if it were nothing more than a tap on the shoulder. Slowly, deliberately, Chuck straightened on his stool. Wooden splinters tumbled from his shoulders, pattering against the floor like rain. He reached for his water glass miraculously, still upright, despite the violence that had erupted around it, and drained the remaining contents in one smooth motion. Then, with the same unhurried precision that had characterized his every movement, Chuck Norris began to turn on his stool. The creak of the bar stool swiveling was the only sound in the petrified silence that had fallen over Road 66 bars. Every patron stood motionless, caught in the magnetic field of what was unfolding before them. Phones that had been raised to capture Cena's chair shot now hung forgotten in slack hands. Chuck completed his turn, now fully facing Cena. Nothing in his expression betrayed pain or anger, no grimace, no narrowed eyes, no flushed cheeks. Only the slight rise and fall of his chest indicated he was flesh and blood rather than carved stone. Wood fragments still clung to his black t-shirt, dusting his shoulders like snow. Cena hadn't moved either. The broken chair legs still clutched in his hands. His cocky grin had faltered, replaced by something less certain, the first hairline crack in his bravado. He'd expected shouting, retaliation, or at least the satisfaction of seeing fear. Chuck's calm gaze offered none of these. "That all you got?" Cena recovered, tossing the chair remnants aside with forced nonchalance. Most guys would be on the floor now. Chuck remained silent, studying Cena with the patient assessment of someone who had seen countless men like him come and go. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, weight centering, feet finding solid placement on the floor. "You deaf or something?" Cena pressed, voice rougher now. "I said, I heard you." Chuck's voice was quiet but carried across the hushed room like thunder over distant hills. The first time, the simple statement hung in the air. Several patrons exchanged glances, their loyalties visibly shifting. They'd come to see John Cena, celebrity wrestler and larger-than-life personality. But now they were witnessing something else, something that made Cena's theatrical strength seem suddenly hollow. "Then why didn't you answer?" Cena demanded, stance widening as if preparing for a match. "Too busy acting mysterious? Playing the strong, silent type?" Chuck stood up. The movement was unhurried, almost gentle. There was nothing threatening in the way he rose to his full height, straightening his shirt with a casual brush of his hand. Yet every person in the bar felt it, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the pressure drop before a tornado. "Some things," Chuck said evenly, "don't need words." A muscle worked in Cena's jaw. For all his bulk and bravado, something in Chuck's calm was rattling him. His eyes darted briefly to his entourage, but they had backed away, leaving a clear circle around the two men. "Look at you," Cena scoffed, gesturing at Chuck's frame, lean but nowhere near as massive as his own. "You think you can take me? I bench press guys like you for warm-ups." Chuck took one step forward. Just one step. Yet the impact was immediate. Several patrons backed away further, pressing against walls and tables. The bartender, Mike, froze with his hand halfway to the phone. "You don't want this fight," Chuck said, his tone not threatening but matter-of-fact. as if stating that water is wet or fire burns. Fight? Cena laughed, but the sound was strained. This wouldn't be a fight. This would be me teaching a history lesson to someone who should have stayed in the past. A woman near the pool tables whispered to her companion, just loud enough to carry, "That's Chuck Norris." The Chuck Norris. Recognition flickered across the faces of several patrons who hadn't made the connection earlier. The atmosphere in the bar subtly shifted again, anticipation mixed now with something like reverence. "Should have said something earlier," Cena said, his voice holding less conviction. "Maybe I'd have asked for an autograph instead. For old time's sake." Chuck took another step forward. Then, another. His movements had a fluid economy to them, like a river that flows around obstacles rather than crashing through them. No wasted energy, no theatrics. "Back up, old man," Cena warned, hands raising instinctively into a wrestler's stance. "Last chance to walk away with your dignity." "Dignity," Chuck repeated, as if considering the word. "Isn't something you take from another man. It's something you lose yourself." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He continued his measured approach until only 3 feet separated them. The height difference was obvious now. Cena towering over Chuck by at least 4 inches. His frame nearly twice as broad. The contrast should have made Chuck seem diminished. Somehow, it didn't. The bar's front door opened, and a burly security guard stepped inside, pausing as he registered the standoff. He moved his hand to his belt reflexively, then froze as his eyes locked on Chuck's face. Recognition, followed by a hesitation that spoke volumes. Even armed and in uniform, he made no move to intervene. "You know what your problem is?" Cena's voice had taken on an edge of desperation. "You old-school guys think mystique and reputation are enough. But in the real world, my world, it's about who hits hardest." "No," Chuck said simply. "It's about who hits last." Something in those words, or perhaps the quiet certainty with which they were delivered, finally penetrated Cena's armor. A flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his face, quickly masked behind bravado. "Big talk," he said, rolling his shoulders. "Let's see if you can back it up." Chuck didn't respond. He simply stood, hands relaxed at his sides, feet planted shoulder-width apart, waiting. His stillness wasn't passive, but coiled the calm surface of deep water. The security guard by the door caught Mike's eye and mouthed what looked like, "Should I?" Mike gave an almost imperceptible headshake. No one was stepping between these two men now. A drop of sweat traced its way down Cena's temple despite the bar's cool air. His eyes darted around the room, registering the changed atmosphere, sensing his audience slipping away from him. For a performer like Cena, losing the crowd was perhaps more unsettling than any physical challenge. "Last chance," Cena said, voice hard, but a new uncertainty in his eyes. "Stand down, old man." Chuck's expression never changed. "I'm standing right here." The simple statement hung in the air like a gauntlet dropped. No threat, no challenge, just a statement of fact that somehow carried more weight than any boast could have. Cena's patience snapped. With a roar that was more frustration than battle cry, he lunged forward, massive arms outstretched to grapple with his smaller opponent. Cena's charge came like a freight train, all raw power and momentum, arms spread wide to engulf his opponent. His wrestling experience was evident in the explosive movement, body launching forward with practiced precision. In the ring, this opening would have sent opponents scrambling or tumbling beneath his weight. Chuck didn't scramble. He didn't retreat. He simply wasn't there. When Cena's grasp closed. A subtle pivot, a half step to the side, the movement so economical it almost escaped notice, and Chuck slipped past Cena's outstretched arms like smoke through fingers. No wasted motion, no flashy dodge. Just the absence where a collision should have been. Cena stumbled, momentum carrying him forward as his target vanished from his path. He recovered quickly, whirling around with athletic grace that belied his size. His face darkened with a mixture of surprise and wounded pride. "Lucky dodge?" he growled, circling now with more caution. He'd repositioned with the same fluid efficiency, hands still unclenched at his sides, posture balanced and ready. Only his eyes moved, tracking Cena with unwavering focus. The bar's patrons had scattered to the walls, creating an improvised ring. Phones were raised again, recording the confrontation that had escalated beyond entertainment into something primal and riveting. No one spoke. No one dared break the spell of what was unfolding. Cena feinted left, then launched a right hook that could have felled an oak. The punch cut through empty air as Chuck swayed back just enough for it to miss by centimeters. Another punch followed. Then another, a flurry of strikes that showcased Cena's power and speed. None connected. Chuck moved like water around stone, never retreating, never backing away, yet never where Cena's fists expected him to be. Each dodge was minimal, conserving energy, letting Cena's own force work against him. "Fight back," Cena demanded, frustration bleeding into his voice as he launched another combination. "Stop dancing and fight me!" For the first time, a hint of something, perhaps amusement, flickered in Chuck's eyes. "Why would I do that?" he asked calmly, slipping another wild swing. "When you're fighting yourself just fine." The comment stung Cena visibly. His next punch came harder, wilder. A haymaker, thrown with more emotion than technique. Chuck didn't just evade this time. He redirected, one hand coming up to guide Cena's arm past his shoulder, using the wrestler's own momentum to send him stumbling forward. The move was so smooth, so effortless, that several onlookers gasped. It hadn't been a block or a counterattack, it was something more elegant, turning strength against itself. Cena regained his footing, face flushing deeper with humiliation and growing anger. "Cute tricks," he spat. "This? How you've made your reputation? Running away? I'm still here," Chuck pointed out mildly. Indeed, he had barely moved from the center of their improvised arena, while Cena had covered twice the distance in his failed attacks. A woman near the pool tables whispered to her companion, just loud enough to carry in the tense silence, "He's toying with him." Her friend nodded, eyes wide with fascination. "Cena doesn't even realize what's happening." The whispers reached Cena, feeding his frustration. His career had been built on dominance, on being the unstoppable force that overwhelmed all opposition. Now he found himself unable to even touch his opponent, let alone assert control over the confrontation. Something changed in Cena's approach. The showman's grin disappeared, replaced by cold focus. He advanced more methodically now, cutting off angles, using the techniques that had made him successful in the ring. His next strike was a probing jab rather than a wild swing. Chuck deflected it with an almost casual gesture, palm turning the punch aside. The touch was light, yet it disrupted Cena's balance momentarily enough to prevent the follow-up strike Cena had planned. "Better," Chuck acknowledged quietly. The first time he'd commented directly on Cena's technique. The simple approval, offered without condescension, somehow irritated Cena more than any taunt could have. His jaw tightened, muscles cording in his neck with tension. "Don't patronize me, old man," he growled, resetting his stance. "I don't need your approval." Chuck didn't respond to the hostility. He simply resumed his ready position, hands loose at his sides, weight balanced evenly between both feet. His breathing remained steady and controlled, chest rising and falling in a rhythm unaltered by the exertion of the confrontation. Cena, by contrast, was breathing harder now, sweat glistening on his forehead and darkening his shirt beneath the arms. The effortlessness of Chuck's defense was beginning to take a psychological toll, eroding the confidence that had been Cena's armor. "You're quick," Cena acknowledged grudgingly, circling again. "For an old man." "Age," Chuck replied, "teaches patience, something youth rarely understands." The statement wasn't delivered as an insult, but as a simple observation. Somehow, that made it cut deeper. Cena's jaw tightened further, and he launched into his next attack, a wrestling takedown, dropping to catch Chuck at the knees. Chuck sidestepped, but this time added a short, sharp counterstrike. His fist connected with Cena's shoulder, not a power blow, but precisely targeted. Cena felt his arm go momentarily numb from the impact point down. "What the hell?" he gasped, shaking out the limb as sensation slowly returned in pins and needles. Chuck had already reset his position, calm as ever. "Pressure point," he explained without inflection. "The body has many." A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Someone whistled low in appreciation or awe. The security guard by the door had given up any pretense of potential intervention, watching now with undisguised fascination. "Did you see that?" a young man in a baseball cap asked his friend, voice hushed with reverence. "One hit, and Cena's arm just stopped working." His companion nodded, filming intently on his phone. "It's like those old martial arts films, but for real." Cena rolled his shoulder, face contorted with a new wariness. He'd felt the precision in that strike, the calculated restraint that suggested Chuck could have done much worse had he chosen to. "Lucky shot," Cena muttered. But the bravado rang hollow now. He was breathing harder, sweat beading visibly on his forehead, while Chuck remained composed. Respiration, steady and controlled. "Luck," Chuck said quietly, "is what the unprepared call skill." The simple philosophy, delivered without heat or arrogance, seemed to ignite something dark in Cena's expression. With a roar, he charged again, abandoning technique for raw aggression. He swung wildly, throwing his full weight behind each punch, determined to overwhelm his opponent through sheer force and volume. Chuck's defense shifted in response. No longer just evasion, but active redirection. He caught Cena's wrist on one punch, turned it slightly to send the force harmlessly past his head. Another strike he met with his forearm, deflecting it downward. Each counter was minimal, each touch precise, never meeting force with force directly, but guiding it away like a river diverts around a stone. "Stop moving," Cena grunted between strikes, each failed attempt feeding his frustration. "I'm not," Chuck replied calmly, deflecting another blow. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The philosophical difference in their approaches was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone watching. Cena fought as if space were something to dominate, to fill with his presence and power. Chuck treated space as something to harmonize with, to navigate with precision rather than brute force. A particularly wild swing from Cena left him off balance. Chuck saw the opening and exploited it with a subtle shift of position. His foot slid forward, hooking briefly behind Cena's ankle, as the larger man's momentum carried him forward. The result was as elegant as it was effective. Cena's own movement became the force that sent him staggering, his balance compromised by the gentle redirection. He didn't fall, but he stumbled badly, nearly colliding with the bar before catching himself. The crowd's reaction was immediate gasps, followed by whispers of appreciation. Someone started to applaud before catching themselves, not wanting to break the spell of the moment. Cena straightened, breathing heavily now, glaring at Chuck with a mixture of frustration and growing doubt. Everything about this confrontation was unfolding differently than he had imagined. In his mind, he had seen himself dominating the older man physically, asserting his superiority through strength and aggression. Instead, he found himself increasingly on the defensive, unable to land a single blow, while his own energy was being systematically turned against him. "This isn't fighting," Cena accused, wiping sweat from his brow. "This is running away." "No," Chuck corrected calmly. "This is understanding that fighting isn't about who hits hardest. It's about who controls the space between." The contrast in styles was starker with each exchange. Cena, all explosive power and theatrical dominance. Chuck, embodying controlled efficiency and deep-rooted strength. Two completely different philosophies of combat, of masculinity itself, clashing before the spellbound audience. Mike the bartender watched from behind the counter, dish towel twisted between his hands. In 30 years running this place, he'd seen countless bar fights, brutal, chaotic affairs that ended with bloody noses and broken furniture. This was something else entirely, a masterclass in the difference between power and mastery. "Is this what you do?" Cena demanded, frustration evident in every line of his body. "Avoid actually fighting? Dance around until the other guy gets tired?" Chuck's expression remained unchanged. "Fighting isn't about punishing your opponent," he said quietly. "It's about protecting yourself while rendering their aggression ineffective." "Real fighters stand their ground," Cena insisted, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for another charge. "Standing your ground and standing still are different things," Chuck replied. "A tree that doesn't bend breaks in the storm." The philosophical exchange seemed to irritate Cena further. He was used to opponents who matched his physical intensity, who engaged on the terms he set. Chuck's approach denied him even that, refusing to accept the framework Cena was trying to impose on their confrontation. "Stand still and fight," Cena demanded, his composure cracking further as he launched another combination of strikes. "I am fighting," Chuck replied calmly, deflecting the blows with minimal movement. "Just not the way you understand." He punctuated the statement with another precise counter. This time, a short strike to Cena's solar plexus, as the wrestler overextended on a punch. The blow wasn't delivered with crushing power, but its placement was surgically exact. Cena felt the air rush from his lungs, his diaphragm seizing momentarily. He staggered back a step, gasping. Shock registered on his face, not just at the effectiveness of the strike, but at how little apparent effort it had required. Chuck hadn't even shifted his weight substantially to deliver it. "That's what I'm talking about," someone in the crowd exclaimed, unable to contain their excitement. "Pressure points, just like in the movies." "Except it's real," another responded in a hushed tone. "Look at Cena's face, he can't believe what's happening." Indeed, Cena's expression had transformed from frustrated anger to something more complex, confusion tinged with the first real glimmerings of doubt. He'd faced countless opponents in his career, from amateur wrestlers to professional fighters, but none had made him feel so utterly ineffective. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Did you see that?" And, "Hardly even moved." And, "Man's a legend for a reason." Cena heard them. The audience that had been his was slipping away with each failed attack, with each demonstration of the older man's mastery. For someone whose career had been built on crowd adoration, this public unraveling was perhaps more devastating than any physical punishment. "You think you're impressing people with these parlor tricks?" Cena taunted, desperate now to regain control of the narrative, if not the physical confrontation. "This isn't real fighting. This is circus acts. Chuck studied him for a moment, something like compassion flickering briefly in his eyes. You're still thinking about the audience, he observed quietly. That's why you can't focus on the fight itself. The simple insight struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. Throughout his career, Cena had been hyper-aware of the crowd, feeding off their energy, performing for their approval. Even now, in this unplanned confrontation in a roadside bar, he couldn't separate his actions from how they would be perceived. Chuck, by contrast, seemed entirely unconcerned with the watching eyes. His focus remained entirely on the immediate interaction between himself and Cena, his awareness extending no further than the space they shared. Enough playing around, Cena snarled, desperation edging into his voice. He lowered his shoulder and charged like a bull, aiming to use his superior weight and strength to simply overwhelm the smaller man. Chuck waited until the last possible moment. Then, with timing honed through decades of discipline, he sidestepped while extending one foot slightly into Cena's path. The trip was subtle, not an aggressive sweep, but a gentle placement that caught Cena's forward momentum and redirected it. The result was spectacular. Cena's own speed and weight became weapons against him as he tumbled forward, crashing into a table that collapsed beneath his bulk. Glass shattered as bottles and mugs went flying. He lay there momentarily, surrounded by debris, the breath knocked from his lungs more by surprise than impact. "Holy shit," someone whispered. Phone raised high to capture the moment. "That's not fighting," Cena accused as he pushed himself up, wiping a trickle of blood from a small cut on his cheek. "That's cheap tricks." "No," Chuck corrected mildly. "That's using what you give me." The philosophical difference couldn't have been clearer. Cena saw combat as domination, the stronger imposing his will through superior force. Chuck understood it as harmony, using an opponent's energy rather than opposing it directly. Mike, the bartender, watched with a mixture of professional concern about his establishment and undeniable fascination with the clash unfolding before him. Part of him wanted to intervene before more furniture was destroyed, but a deeper wisdom held him back. Some confrontations needed to reach their natural conclusion. "You can't keep dodging forever," Cena warned, getting back to his feet. "Sooner or later, you have to stand and fight." "I am standing," Chuck pointed out. Indeed, throughout the entire exchange, he had maintained his position in the center of their improvised arena. It was Cena who had covered the ground, who had stumbled and fallen, who had been forced to constantly readjust his position. The irony wasn't lost on the watching crowd. A few chuckles escaped, quickly stifled but audible enough for Cena to hear. His face darkened further with humiliation as he realized how thoroughly the narrative was slipping from his control. Cena got to his feet, breathing heavily now, his pristine appearance marred by sweat, blood, and dust. His confident swagger had disappeared, replaced by the desperation of a man who senses control slipping away. "Let's finish this," he growled, and lunged forward for what everyone in the room somehow knew would be the final exchange. The atmosphere in Road 66 bars had transformed completely. What had begun as entertainment, a celebrity sighting spiced with confrontation, had evolved into something more primal. A clash between fundamentally different philosophies of strength. The crowd watched in reverent silence, sensing they were witnessing something rarely seen outside of controlled competitions or action films. Cena gathered himself for one final assault. His breathing came in heavy bursts, sweat gleaming on his skin under the bar's dim lights. The cocky showman had vanished, replaced by something raw, a cornered predator, fighting not just for victory but for identity itself. "You're done, old man," he growled, circling Chuck with renewed focus. "No more games. No more tricks." Chuck remained centered, His posture relaxed, yet alert. Nothing in his expression revealed fatigue or concern. If anything, there was a quiet assessment in his gaze, as if he were reading not just Cena's physical movements, but the emotional currents driving them. "This isn't about me," Chuck said quietly. "It never was." The simple observation struck deeper than any physical blow could have. Cena's face contorted, the truth of the statement hitting a nerve that his pride couldn't protect. A middle-aged man near the pool table whispered to his companion, "Look at Cena's eyes, he knows he's in trouble." His friend nodded, phone still recording. "Never seen him look like that before. Like he's scared." The whispers weren't quiet enough. Cena's eyes darted briefly toward them, a flash of something vulnerable crossing his features before hardening again into determination. The crowd's shifting allegiance was unmistakable. Another wound to his already battered ego. Cena rolled his massive shoulders, the muscles rippling beneath his sweat-soaked shirt. The movement was deliberately intimidating, a physical reminder of the advantage he still believed would ultimately prevail. Size, strength, youth. "You talk a good game," Cena said. His voice lowered to a dangerous rumble. "All that philosophical crap sounds nice, but at the end of the day," he thumped his chest with a closed fist, "this is what matters. Raw power." Chuck regarded him with the same steady calmness that had characterized his demeanor throughout the confrontation. "Power without control," he observed, "is just chaos waiting to happen." Something in the statement, perhaps its simple truth, or the absence of mockery in its delivery, seemed to wound Cena more than any previous exchange. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck standing out like cables. "Control this," he snarled. With a roar that was almost primal, Cena launched forward, abandoning all pretense of technique or strategy. This was his signature move from the wrestling ring, the full-body tackle that had flattened countless opponents beneath arena lights while crowds chanted his name. Time seemed to slow for everyone watching. Cena's massive frame hurtled forward like a human battering ram, muscles tensed, face locked in a grimace of determination. Chuck stood his ground until the last possible moment, when the collision seemed inevitable. Then he moved. It wasn't a dramatic leap or a theatrical sidestep. Chuck pivoted slightly, his body turning just enough for Cena's charge to miss its center mass. But this time, unlike previous evasions, Chuck's hands came up not to block, but to guide. His palms contacted Cena's shoulder and arm as the wrestler barreled past. The touch seemed gentle, almost inconsequential, but it was precisely timed and placed. Chuck wasn't opposing Cena's force, but adding to it, redirecting it with a subtle twist that sent the larger man off balance. Cena stumbled, momentum carrying him forward, while his body turned involuntarily with the guidance of Chuck's hands. For a sickening moment, he was completely vulnerable, weight committed forward, balance compromised, defenses open. Mike, the bartender, found himself holding his breath, dish towel clutched in white-knuckled hands. He'd seen countless bar fights over the decades, but nothing like this. The contrast between Cena's raw aggression and Chuck's measured control, creating a tension that was almost unbearable. Chuck's counterattack came not as a flurry of blows but as a single, focused strike. His fist connected with Cena's midsection, a point just below the rib cage where muscle offers less protection to vital nerve clusters. The impact wasn't delivered with theatrical wind-up or excessive force. It didn't need to be. The precision made it devastating. Cena's eyes widened in shock more than pain. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The air left his lungs in a silent rush, as internal systems momentarily short-circuited from the perfectly placed blow. For a suspended moment, he stood frozen, body trying to process what had happened. Then, like a mighty tree finally succumbing to a patient lumberjack's precise cuts, John Cena crumpled to the floor. The impact of his fall seemed to break the spell that had held the bar in thrall. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by stunned murmurs. Someone dropped a glass, the shattering sound abnormally loud in the shocked aftermath. "Oh my God," a young woman whispered, her phone still raised to capture the moment. "He dropped him with one hit, just one. That wasn't just a punch," an older man beside her said, his voice filled with something like reverence. "That was, I don't even know what that was." Chuck stepped back, hands returning to his sides. There was no triumph in his expression, no celebration in his posture. If anything, he looked vaguely regretful, not at the outcome, but at the necessity of the confrontation itself. Cena lay on his side, curled slightly around the point of impact. He wasn't unconscious, but his body refused momentary commands, nervous system still recalibrating from the precise trauma it had experienced. His breathing came in shallow gasps, eyes wide with something beyond physical pain, the shock of absolute defeat. One of Cena's companions, a stocky man with a shaved head, took a half step forward as if to intervene. Chuck's gaze shifted slightly in his direction, and the man froze, then retreated back to the wall. The wordless exchange spoke volumes about the new dynamic in the room. No one was rushing to Cena's aid, not from lack of loyalty, but from a deep, instinctive recognition of when to stand down. The security guard finally stirred from his position by the door, approaching cautiously. "Should I call someone?" he asked. The question directed at no one in particular. "He'll be fine," Chuck said quietly. "Just give him a minute." The certainty in his voice was reassuring, not a boast or a dismissal, but the knowledge of someone who understood precisely what he had done. It was the same measured confidence that had characterized his every movement, his every response throughout the confrontation. As if on cue, Cena stirred more deliberately, pushing himself to a sitting position with visible effort. His face was ashen, pride wounded far deeper than flesh. He stared up at Chuck with new eyes, the bravado stripped away, replaced by a raw, reluctant respect. "What?" he began, voice raspy. "What was that?" "Kyusho Jitsu," Chuck answered simply. "The study of vital points. The body has maps most fighters never learn to read." Cena nodded, slowly, processing this. With effort, he pushed himself to his knees, then to his feet, swaying slightly. His entourage stepped forward to steady him, but he waved them off, determined to stand on his own. "I didn't think," Cena started, then shook his head. "I've never felt anything like that." "Few have," Chuck acknowledged. "It's not about strength. It's about knowledge." The crowd watched this exchange in fascinated silence. Many were still recording, phones raised to capture what had become something more than entertainment. A rare moment of genuine humility from a man whose public persona had been built on invincibility. "He looks different," someone murmured from the back of the room. The observation was remarkably astute. Something had shifted in Cena's physical presence, not just the obvious signs of defeat like the sweat staining his shirt or the small trickle of blood from the cut on his cheekbone. It was something more fundamental, as if a mask had slipped, revealing the man beneath the performer. "I underestimated you," Cena admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. Chuck shook his head slightly. "No. You overestimated yourself. There's a difference." The statement wasn't delivered as an insult, but as a teaching, the kind of hard truth that, if accepted, becomes a turning point. Cena flinched as though the words hit harder than the physical blow had. For a moment, the bar held its collective breath. Cena's hands curled into fists at his sides, and several onlookers tensed, anticipating another explosion of aggression. The humiliation of defeat sometimes breeds desperate retaliation. Instead, Cena's shoulders slumped slightly. The change was subtle but profound. The physical manifestation of pride, giving way to reluctant wisdom. They told me you were different, he muttered, almost to himself. Said you weren't like other fighters. Who's they? Chuck asked. Genuine curiosity in his voice for the first time. Cena gestured vaguely. People. In the business. Old-timers who've been around. He winced, rubbing his midsection where the decisive strike had landed. They said you didn't just know how to fight. You understood why fighting exists in the first place. Chuck considered this, his expression thoughtful. Fighting exists because conflict is inevitable, he said finally. How we handle that conflict defines who we are. The philosophical observation hung in the air, surprising in its depth, yet delivered with the same straightforward simplicity as everything else Chuck had said. It wasn't pretentious wisdom but earned insight, distilled through decades of experience. Mike, the bartender, cautiously approached with a glass of water and a clean bar towel. He offered both to Cena, who accepted them with a nod of thanks. The cold water against his face seemed to bring him further back to himself. Jesus, someone whispered from the crowd. Did you see how fast that happened? One hit, another replied. Just one. Phones still recorded, capturing the aftermath. That was, in its way, more compelling than the confrontation itself. The defeated champion, finding his footing, the victor showing neither gloat nor grandiosity. A young man in his 20s, emboldened by alcohol and the dramatic turn of events, called out from near the pool tables. Yo, Chuck. Do that pressure point thing again. Show us how it works. Chuck glanced in his direction, expression neither annoyed nor indulgent. That's not how it works, he said simply. It's not a party trick. The subtle rebuke silenced the young man more effectively than anger could have. Chuck hadn't raised his voice or changed his tone, yet the response carried a quiet authority that demanded respect. Cena dabbed at the small cut on his cheekbone, wincing slightly. Been in this game 15 years, he said, voice steadier now. Never saw that coming. That's why it worked. Chuck replied simply. A laugh bubbled up from Cena's chest, surprised, genuine, tinged with self-deprecation. Yeah. I guess that's the point. The moment of honest amusement, so different from the theatrical showmanship Cena had displayed earlier, seemed to shift the atmosphere in the bar. Some of the tension dissipated, replaced by something more reflective. He straightened fully, testing his body's response, finding it functional if sore. His gaze swept the room, taking in the watching crowd, the phones, the expressions ranging from awe to smug satisfaction. The public nature of his defeat clearly registered. Another blow to weather. This'll be all over the internet by morning, he observed. Chuck shrugged lightly. Fame is fleeting. Lessons last longer. The philosophical perspective seemed to land with Cena. He nodded slowly, something shifting behind his eyes, perhaps the first genuine respect he'd shown since entering the bar. How long did it take you? Cena asked suddenly. To learn. Whatever that was. Chuck considered the question, his expression thoughtful. I'm still learning, he said finally. That's the point. Mastery isn't a destination. It's a path you walk every day. The humility in the response coming from a man whose skills had just been so dramatically demonstrated made a visible impression on Cena and everyone else in the room. Here was someone who had reached the pinnacle of his art, yet still considered himself a student. So what now? Cena asked, gesturing vaguely between them. We shake hands? Pretend this never happened? Neither, Chuck answered. He turned slightly, looking toward his abandoned water glass at the bar. Now we go our separate ways, having learned what we needed to. The simplicity of the statement, Its lack of ceremony or dramatic resolution seemed to catch Cena off guard. In his world of staged conflicts and choreographed conclusions, there was always a clear ending, a decisive moment where victor and vanquished acknowledged their roles. Chuck offered no such theater. He began moving toward the bar counter, intent apparently on settling his tab and departing without fanfare. Cena's face tightened, a flash of his earlier frustration returning. He took a quick step forward, hand extending to grab Chuck's shoulder. "Hey! We're not done!" Chuck turned with a speed that belied his age. His hand caught Cena's wrist mid-reach, not gripping it aggressively, but holding it with the same precise control he demonstrated throughout their encounter. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes shifted a warning as clear as any words. "We are done," he said quietly. The two men stood frozen for a heartbeat, Cena towering physically over Chuck, yet somehow diminished in the older man's presence. The bar held its collective breath again. Then, slowly, Chuck released Cena's wrist, his movement deliberate and final. Cena let his arm drop to his side. "Yeah," he said, voice rough. "I guess we are." He stepped back, creating space between them, a physical acknowledgement of a boundary he had failed to respect earlier. Something had finally penetrated the armor of his ego, reaching the man beneath the persona. An older patron, a weather-beaten man in his 70s wearing a faded military cap, caught Cena's eye from his position at the bar. "Hardest fights ain't the ones you lose, son," the old veteran offered gruffly. "They're the ones that force you to see yourself clearly." The unexpected wisdom from a stranger seemed to resonate with Cena. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that contained more genuine respect than anything he'd displayed all night. Chuck turned back to the bar, laid a $20 bill beside his empty water glass, and nodded once to Mike. Then he started toward the exit, his stride unhurried but purposeful. The crowd parted before him like water around the prow of a ship, phones lowering out of something like respect. No one spoke. No one approached him. The silent acknowledgement seemed fitting words would have only diminished what they had witnessed. At the door, Chuck paused, glancing back once at Cena, who stood motionless in the center of the room. Their eyes met across the distance, a final exchange more profound than any physical contact had been. Then Chuck was gone, the door swinging closed behind him with a soft thud that seemed to break the spell holding the bar in thrall. Conversation erupted all at once, voices overlapping in excited recounting of what they'd just witnessed. Phones were checked to ensure the footage had saved properly. Several patrons hurried to the door, perhaps hoping for one more glimpse of Chuck, but he had already vanished into the night. Cena remained standing where Chuck had left him, seemingly deaf to the buzz around him. His entourage approached cautiously, unsure of his mood after such a public humbling. "John? You okay, man?" one ventured. Cena didn't answer immediately. He stared at the door through which Chuck had departed, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone in the bar had heard it all night. "Get me a water," he said. "Just water." Dawn broke over Road 66 bars, pale light filtering through windows still smudged with the evidence of the previous night's activity. Outside, a solitary figure swept broken glass from the gravel parking lot, the rhythmic scrape of broom against stone, the only sound disturbing the morning stillness. Mike paused in his cleaning to watch a pickup truck rumble past on the highway, its driver oblivious to the events that had transformed this unremarkable roadside establishment into something approaching hallowed ground. He leaned on his broom, surveying the bar's exterior with the weary pride of a caretaker. In 30 years of running this place, he'd seen countless fights, brutal, chaotic affairs that always ended the same way. Broken furniture, bloodied knuckles, wounded pride. But last night had been different. What unfolded between Chuck Norris and John Cena wasn't just a fight. It was a revelation, a moment when the veil between perception and reality had briefly parted. Inside, the damage was surprisingly minimal. A broken table, some shattered glassware, chair fragments swept into a neat pile by the entrance. Physical evidence that seemed wholly inadequate to mark what had transpired, like finding only a scorched circle of grass where lightning had struck. The door creaked open, and Mike turned to find his morning bartender, Jessie, arriving for her shift. She was in her mid-30s, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, lines at the corners of her eyes, speaking of a life lived honestly, if not always easily. "Heard there was some excitement last night," she said by way of greeting, pulling her jacket tighter against the morning chill. Mike snorted softly. "That's one way of putting it." "So?" she prompted, eyebrows raised expectantly. "Was it really him? Chuck Norris?" "Yeah." Mike nodded slowly, unsure how to convey the weight of what he'd witnessed. It was him, and did he really take down John Cena with one hit? That's what everyone's saying online. My phone's been blowing up since 2 a.m., with people asking if we've got footage. Mike considered this, head tilting slightly as he recalled the moment. "One hit," he confirmed. "But it wasn't about the hit. It was everything else." Jessie looked confused. "What do you mean?" Mike struggled to find words adequate to the experience. How could he explain the fundamental difference he'd seen embodied in those two men? One who approached conflict as a performance, a demonstration of dominance. The other, who moved through it with the serene efficiency of someone who had transcended the need to prove anything. "It's like," he started, then paused, reformulating. Cena was trying to prove something. Chuck wasn't. That was the difference. He gave up on the explanation, knowing it fell short. Some things couldn't be conveyed secondhand. You had to witness them. And even then, different people would take away different lessons. "Help me finish up out here," he said instead. "We're opening early today. Expect a crowd." Jessie glanced at the bar skeptically. "A crowd? On a Wednesday morning?" "Trust me," Mike said, returning to his sweeping. Words already spread. By the time they unlocked the doors at 10 a.m., a small group had already gathered in the parking lot. Mostly locals, but a few faces Mike didn't recognize, visitors from neighboring towns, drawn by social media reports of what had transpired. They filed in with an air of reverence, like pilgrims entering a shrine. Inside the bar, his prediction was already proving accurate. By noon, nearly every stool was occupied, and the tables filled steadily as word spread. The lunch crowd was 3 times its usual size. They came from nearby towns, some from as far as the city 2 hours away. Locals mixed with curiosity seekers, all drawn by the videos that had exploded across social media overnight. "Right there is where it happened," one patron told another, pointing to the spot in front of the bar where Chuck had stood. "My buddy was here. Said you could feel it in the air. I heard Cena broke a chair over his back. And the old man didn't even flinch." Someone else recounted, embellishing slightly. "Nah. It was more than that." Another corrected. "The whole point is that Norris didn't need to show off. Didn't need to prove nothing to nobody." A heavy-set trucker with forearms thick as fence posts leaned across his table. "I watched the video 6 times on my break," he said. "Never seen anything like it. That last move where he just touched Cena and the big guy folded, that wasn't special effects. That was knowledge." His companion nodded sagely. "My uncle studied some martial art in Japan years back. Said there were masters who could drop you with just a finger if they hit the right spot. Pressure points." A third man chimed in. "That's what Chuck was using. He wasn't trying to overpower Cena, he was shutting down his nervous system. The story was evolving already, details shifting with each retelling. But the essence remained intact, the contrast between two types of strength, two approaches to power, two generations of masculine ideals. Near the pool tables, a group of younger men were attempting to recreate Chuck's movements, their clumsy mimicry highlighting just how effortless the real thing had been. No, he didn't block. He redirected. One insisted, waving his arms in demonstration. It was like the punch just flowed past him. Whatever, man. I'm telling you. It was the pressure point strike that was the real deal. Right here. He jabbed a finger toward his friend's midsection, who flinched away, laughing. You couldn't pressure point your way out of a paper bag, Tim. By mid-afternoon, Road 66 Bars was doing the kind of business usually reserved for major sporting events or holiday weekends. Mike had called in extra staff, and the kitchen was running at full capacity, turning out burgers and fries to the curious crowds. A local news van had even pulled into the parking lot, a perky reporter setting up for a segment on the viral barroom showdown that has social media buzzing. Mike had politely but firmly declined to be interviewed on camera, offering only, it was something you had to see in person. Behind the bar, Jessie worked at a frantic pace, pouring beers and mixing drinks with practiced efficiency. During a rare lull, she leaned toward Mike, voice lowered. You think he'll come back? She asked. Norris, I mean. Mike shook his head. Doubt it. Doesn't seem like the type to revisit old stories. And Cena? Mike considered this, wiping down a glass thoughtfully. Him. I'm not so sure about. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the door swung open, and John Cena stepped into Road 66 Bars for the second time in 24 hours. The reaction was immediate. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned. Phones emerged from pockets. But today's Cena was a different man than the one who had swaggered in the night before. Gone were the tight-fitting clothes designed to showcase his physique. Today he wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. No entourage accompanied him. His entrance was quiet, almost humble, as if deliberately choosing to leave the performer outside. He paused just inside the doorway, taking in the crowd that had clearly gathered because of him. Or more accurately, because of what had happened to him. A flash of something discomfort, perhaps embarrassment, crossed his features before he schooled his expression back to neutrality. Mike moved from behind the bar, approaching with cautious professionalism. Can I help you? Cena met his gaze directly. Just wanted to settle my tab from last night, he said. Things ended, abruptly. Mike nodded. On the house, he offered. Considering the circumstances. No. Cena shook his head firmly. I'll pay for what I ordered. And the table, he added, glancing toward the spot where he'd crashed through the furniture. Mike studied him for a moment, then nodded again. All right. I'll ring it up. As they moved toward the bar, the crowd's attention followed them like a physical weight. Whispers rippled through the room. Can't believe he came back. And got some nerve showing his face. And think he's looking for a rematch. Cena seemed to hear them, but gave no indication that the comments registered. He stood at the counter, posture straight, but not imposing, while Mike tallied the bill. When it was presented, he paid in cash, adding a generous tip without comment. Business concluded, he turned to leave, clearly having accomplished what he'd come for. But something made him pause midway to the door, perhaps the weight of unfinished business, or the rare opportunity to address a narrative before it hardened into legend. He turned back to face the room, aware that every eye was upon him, that phones were recording, that whatever he said next would likely follow him far beyond these walls. "Just so we're clear," he said, voice carrying easily in the hushed space. "What happened last night that was real? No stunts. No setup." He paused, the admission visibly costing him something. "And I deserved what I got." A murmur ran through the crowd, surprised by both his return and his candor. "Chuck Norris is the real deal," Cena continued, something like reluctant respect coloring his tone. "There's a difference between being strong and being a master. I learned that the hard way." The simple acknowledgement seemed to shift the atmosphere in the bar. The voyeuristic edge that had characterized the crowd's energy softened into something more contemplative. Cena nodded once, as if concluding an internal dialogue, then turned again toward the exit. "Hey, Cena," someone called out. "You gonna try for round 2 someday?" Cena paused with his hand on the door. A small, rueful smile crossed his face. "Some lessons," he said. "You only need to learn once." With that, he pushed through the door and was gone, leaving behind a bar full of people, with a story they'd be telling for years to come. Outside, the sun had climbed high, casting short shadows across the gravel lot. Cena stood for a moment, breathing in the clean air, feeling oddly lightened despite the lingering soreness in his midsection where Chuck's single strike had landed. In the harsh daylight, away from the artificial atmosphere of the bar, the events of the previous night seemed almost dreamlike. But the lesson that was solid, tangible, something he could carry forward. He'd built a career on projecting invincibility, on being the strongest, the loudest, the most dominant force in any room. It had brought him fame, fortune, the adoration of millions. But somewhere along the way, he'd confused the persona with the person, the character with the man. One quiet encounter with genuine mastery had cut through years of accumulated ego, revealing a truth he'd lost sight of. True strength never needs to announce itself. It simply is. Cena got into his car, wincing slightly as his bruised muscles protested. As he started the engine, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror, the face familiar from countless posters and promotional materials, yet somehow different now. Changed in ways subtle but profound. He pulled onto the highway, leaving Road 66 bars behind, the building growing smaller in his mirror until it disappeared around a bend. But the lesson remained, settling into his bones like a truth he'd always known but forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood until now. Back inside the bar, life continued. Drinks were served, stories exchanged, the day's business proceeding with renewed energy. Mike returned to his post behind the counter, fielding questions about both Chuck and Cena with diplomatic vagueness, letting the patrons fill in their own details. "He really came back to pay his tab," an older woman remarked, sounding impressed. "That says something about the man." "The real Cena? Or the act?" her companion asked. "Hard to know which is which with these celebrities." "Maybe that's what he's figuring out now," she replied thoughtfully. In the corner where Chuck had sat, a small memorial of sorts had already appeared. A glass of water, placed reverently on a napkin, untouched and unremarked upon. It would remain there all day. A simple tribute that somehow said more than any elaborate gesture could have. By evening, the crowd had thinned somewhat, though the bar remained busier than usual for a weekday. The story continued to spread online, videos shared and reshared, commentators debating what exactly had happened in that unassuming roadside establishment. Some focused on the technical aspects of the confrontation, analyzing Chuck's technique, Cena's mistakes, the physics of the decisive blow. Others found deeper meaning in the encounter, a parable about humility, about different forms of strength, About substance over style. Watch that video maybe 15 times now? A silver-haired man told Mike as he paid his tab. Something different every time. Used to do some boxing in the service. Thought I knew fighting. But what Norris did, that wasn't fighting. That was something else entirely. Mike nodded, understanding completely. Been trying to put it into words all day. Best I can come up with is, Cena was fighting Chuck. Chuck was just dealing with reality. The old boxer considered this, then smiled slowly. That's it. Exactly. Might have to steal that line. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, a black SUV pulled up outside the bar. Its windows were tinted, its lines sleek and expensive. For a moment, Mike wondered if it was Cena returning, or perhaps even Chuck. Instead, a young woman in a crisp blazer emerged, her posture and demeanor screaming, "Corporate." She entered the bar, scanning the room with professional efficiency before approaching Mike at the counter. "You the owner?" she asked, without preamble. Mike nodded cautiously, already anticipating the direction this might go. She produced a business card, glossy, embossed with a media company logo. "I represent True Story Productions. We're interested in the rights to what happened here last night. Exclusive interviews, location filming, the works." Mike studied the card without taking it. "Not interested," he said simply. The woman blinked, clearly unused to immediate rejection. "You haven't heard our offer yet. We're prepared to be very generous. This could be a significant opportunity for your establishment." "This place has been here 30 years, Mike replied. "It'll be here 30 more without turning what happened into some kind of circus." "It's already a circus," she pointed out, gesturing to the still crowded bar, the impromptu water glass memorial, the patrons recording videos in front of the spot where Chuck had stood. "We're just offering to make it profitable for you." Mike shook his head. What happened here wasn't about profit. It was about principle. And I'm not selling either. The woman's expression hardened slightly, but she nodded, recognizing an immovable object when she encountered one. She slid her card across the counter anyway. "In case you change your mind," she said, then turned and left. Jesse, who had been listening from nearby, moved closer once the door closed behind the producer. "That was probably a lot of money you just turned down," she observed. Mike pocketed the card with no intention of ever using it. "Some things aren't for sale," he said simply. "You think either of them will ever talk about it?" Jesse asked as they closed up that night. "Give interviews or whatever?" Mike shook his head as he counted out the register. "Cena might someday, when enough time has passed. Chuck? Never. Why not?" Mike looked up from the cash drawer, considering the question. Because for guys like Chuck, it was never about the story. It was about the principle. He closed the register with a final click. And principles don't need publicity. They finished closing in companionable silence, turning chairs onto tables, sweeping floors, restocking the bar for tomorrow's business, which would likely be busier than usual for some time to come. Outside, the neon sign flickered to life against the gathering darkness, casting its red glow across the now empty parking lot. Inside, the bar settled into the comfortable quiet that follows significant events, holding the echo of what had transpired there, a moment when two very different kinds of strength had collided, and both men had left changed by the encounter. A week later, Mike received a package. No return address. No note enclosed. Just a small, carefully wrapped box. Inside, he found a simple wooden sign, the letters burned into the grain with careful precision. "True strength needs no audience." Mike smiled, running his fingers over the weathered wood. He knew immediately who had sent it, though the sender would never acknowledge it. He hung the sign behind the bar that same day. Just above the spot where Chuck had Saturday, customers often asked about it, and Mike would simply shrug and say, "Just something to remember." But he knew, as did anyone who had been present that night, exactly what it meant. The truth doesn't require validation or verification. It doesn't seek approval or demand acknowledgement. Like the quiet master who had demonstrated it, it simply is patient, enduring, content to be discovered by those ready to learn. In time, the story would fade from headlines, replaced by newer sensations. The videos would be buried beneath fresh content. Even the bar's brief fame would diminish, returning it to the anonymous roadside establishment it had been before. But the lesson remained, preserved in the memories of those who had witnessed it and in the changed perspective of a humbled champion. For some, it became a touchstone, a reference point against which to measure their own conduct. For others, it was simply a good story to tell over drinks, the night when showmanship met substance, and substance won. John Cena returned to his career, though those who knew him well noticed subtle changes in how he carried himself, how he interacted with fans and fellow performers. Less swagger, more substance. The persona remained, but it no longer consumed the man behind it. Chuck Norris never spoke publicly about what had happened. He had no need to. The lesson had been delivered not for public consumption or personal glory, but because it had been necessary in that moment, teaching by example rather than pronouncement. And so the legend grew, not through promotion or publicity, but through the quiet power of truth recognized. Road 66 Bars became something of an unassuming landmark, a place where people sometimes stopped to sit at the corner stool, order water, and contemplate what it means to possess strength that requires no validation. Real power doesn't shout for attention or demand acknowledgement. It waits, calm and centered, revealing itself only when necessary. And when it does, it changes everything. John Cena had learned this lesson through painful experience. Chuck Norris had embodied it without saying a word. And in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.